in Spokane. We've been circuiting around in the high 70s and 80s here, so no long sleeve shirts for the old Gipper for the moment, at least. Well, our signal is looking halfway decent. We've got an announcement to make regarding a new patron. Last week, we had dear Barbara Arnson in the field, and now we have Scott Duke joining the patron. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Every little bit accumulates and makes life more and more amenable to continuing one week after another without the anxiety that fewer patrons would cause. So thank you so much. We've got, again, a two-part show. Hopefully our signal will hold up all the way through as I'd hoped. Let me remove the old sharing and bring my mug up and short sleeve shirts accordingly. We've been continuing on with Nathaniel Jensen's Traced and his section on sources that's looking really peculiar because he's got a total of 117 technical papers in his bibliography, but here we are already on page 141, and he's only cited 13 of them. Hi, Barbara. I have just mentioned the fact that you are one of our new patrons, and we got Scott Duke in as yet another one, so the latest to join the RJ patronage parade. It strikes me that, my gosh, he's been slow on the uptake on this stuff, although he's, of the 13 that he's cited so far, he's managed to misrepresent or avoid the content of 9 of them. So there's only 4 that are technically okay. He's not making misrepresentations of it because he's not really about an area that brings up information that conflicts with the big slosh dogmas. And he's very tight on that. At the moment, he's still in the Americas, so he cites a couple 2018 papers on that page 141, Canuto, which I will be putting a link up to, on how extensive Maya settlements were, which of course is like 800 AD, long after the big slosh period when Mesoamerican ancestors are supposedly traipsing in lickety-split from Ararat. The other paper he cited on the page by Laughlin, 2018, unfortunately isn't available open access yet. It's tracking changes in the Andean Amazon corridor, which again is in a time frame that is much more recent than the big slosh, although I thought it rather ironic that Jensen rather cheekily remarked of it, quote, with radiocarbon dating, they established the chronology of the later layers, unquote. So radiocarbon dating is okay if it's like recent. See, that's part of the little dynamic of him having to slide the information along a curve to be able to dispense with the tens of thousands of years that you can do with it. Anyway, the paper had noted, though, that maize, quote, is known to have been cultivated in the adjacent Amazonian lowlands from around 6,000 years ago, unquote, citing a work from way back in 1989 by Bush that is available open access. And so I'll be putting a linkage to that. So the idea that the chronology and the archaeological data clearly is shooting over his boundary layer is not exactly a news bulletin. He should have been dealing with it or alluding to it rather than simply deciding he can scrunch all of this material up. The part 2 section is really kind of funky, relating to a posting from last year by Gavin Cox on gold deposits formed by the global flood. Oops, jiggle the old laptop here. This little puppy. And of course, I'll be sticking a little link into that little thing so you can compare that with the source material. He was trying to make a little too much hay out of a paper from PNAS from back in 2021, Colloidal Transport and Flocculation of the Cause of the Hyper-Enrichment of Gold in Nature by McLeish. And that is far enough back that we will, in fact, be able to put that in as an open access material because everything becomes open access at PNAS after a year. The McLeish paper is regarding how gold concentrations get assembled. And Cox, of course, is contending that it comes from the big slosh, which required selectively quoting from it and leaving out how they were explicitly talking about gold or transport going back 184 million years. That's not going to cut it. Some of the other material that unfortunately isn't so available open access, but I've been drawing on in that area. We'll probably be citing some of this in Rocks Were There Volume 2 when it comes out. Origins of the high-grade early Jurassic Brucejack epithermal deposits from 2018, which goes into some of this material. This is not stuff that good old Cox cited. So it's clearly an example of cherry picking all around, and the fact that minerals and how they're sorted out geologically and why they're in certain spots and not others is an area that conventional geology has been pretty good at doing, and creationists have been pretty good at not doing. As far as we can tell, nobody has made a dime by thinking about what flood geology would say about why things are the way they are and when they are, and being able to anticipate that. They're able to hitchhike on existing material to the extent that they simply compress and scrunch. But it never quite gets to a workable stage as to what kind of model they think is going on. So that one of the points that I like to invest in everybody who decides to dive into criticizing creationism or any doctrinal ideology, because it's all the same bad method, is, do they ever say what they think happened? Can they even imagine what they think happened? Or is their argument one that they don't think something else happened, and therefore they think, aha, our option must be the correct one? It'll be an amusement if you want to go through to compare the superficial gloss that Cox made of the McLeish paper, and compare to see why he's picking out the little snippets that he does, and how extensive and interesting the scientific work is compared to the superficial fluff that goes on. And Cox gets a lot of mentions in the new book because he glides into an awful lot of areas. And I think, as I recall, also some of Cox glides into the big issues of pre-Columbian and medieval discussions of what dinosaurs were supposedly seen and all of that. So there's a slippy slide that Cox is going down on a variety of levels, that this gold issue is just a peripheral one in that area. So I'll be still wondering, I'm still waiting for the shoes to drop on Jensen, because I mentioned last week that there's a big section in the middle of his book, which are a bunch of the color plates. Not a single one of them has a reference to it. So they're not saying, oh, here's my interpretation of such and so a paper. All of this is his own rearrangement, ultimately, of a few papers that I've mentioned in previous episodes that he's drawing off of, which still leaves 100 or so technical citations that are going to have to pop up at some stage. So I'm hoping that somewhere along the line, at the later ends of the chapters, we're going to start getting some really tight source spewing, at which point we'll be able to see what he's using in what order and why he's lumping together the material that he does. And the interesting part then will be cross-comparing, as I've already seen in other examples, when he would be bringing up older material and not alluding to newer stuff, even though he presumably must have known about it because he'd been criticized about it, that papers that somehow or other don't make it into his discussion. All of these little back-end details are extremely useful to see what material is theoretically available to somebody. Just like all you had to do is look in the McLeish paper, and you could have seen that reference to that Bush paper from 1989 and on the chronology. So there's all sorts of portals that open up, whereas the modality that occurs among creationists is doors being closed, not opening things up, not alluding to the material in such a way that you would then follow up and follow up and follow up. And most importantly, not applying the information constantly to the model that they don't actually have. It's all a cartoon. And it can never, I would contend, ever get too much beyond a cartoon. Because to try to work out why that little deposit over there is the way it is based upon the supposed big flood, and to work out sequentially what's going on and how things could have been transported and what's been moving where and how much energy that involves. And all of that stuff is a scenario that if they tried to really work through it, they're going to find that it's never going to work. In the same way, the conspiracy theories about everybody but Oswald killed Kennedy, or conspiracy theories that in the extreme case, flat earthers offer for how come people keep on buying into the globe Earth instead of supposedly seeing the obvious flatness of it in their model. That groups are always going to have to imply things about the nature of the scientific analysis and the nature of the evidence that people are drawing on that's increasingly implausible. And it would explain ultimately why they're not gaining any traction in any area. I've been overall surprised at how repetitive and thin Jensen's book is. That even though it is supposedly written for a little more general audience, the previous book, Reinventing Darwin, Replacing Darwin, was at least trying to look more sciencey. They had a much higher incidence of scientific footnotes in it than what we're getting in here. So it's a much lighter book. And that would account for why even the creationist community like Carter hasn't exactly jumped up and down in joy over this. And although Ken Ham wrote a glowing little endorsement on it, it's kind of landed with a thud. And you wonder whether or not anybody, even at a creationist-oriented university, would ever want to draw on the damn thing. But we'll see. I've went through in my master bibliography for Jensen's book and cataloged all of the sources. And now as I'm going through page by page, then I'm slipping them over to figure out, okay, has it now been cited? And so we'll see whether he ends up actually citing everything. It's heavily dumbed down for a dumbed down world. Yeah, that's very possible. That what in principle would have prevented, let me put that up for everyone to see there. What in principle would have prevented Jensen to have written a detailed technical book on a par with the kind of stuff that moi can pull off at my level, and I just have a BA in history. What would it be stopping him to do that? Unless it's basically preaching to the converted. And from conversations that he's had with Dan Stern Cardinale, Jensen believes everything he says. He believes that he's got it absolutely dead on target right. He has no problems with the fact that he is conflating mutation rates in the somatic cells versus mutation rates and fixation rates in germline cells, that he's messing all of that together. That doesn't bother him in the slightest. And so it's kind of not merely preaching to the converted, he's writing to kind of puff piece his own insular little world. And he clearly did some new research, which appears to have been scavenging up for little color quotations and stuff from a bunch of general books on the various cultures that he's encountered. But as I've already been looking into in the last few weeks, that on example after example of very specific science issues that he brings up, he's not looking any farther than just the main paper he's been drawing on for the last 5 or 6 years. That he just takes that data field from the Bergstrom paper and like-minded material that he's glommed onto, and then he's massaged it and turned it into his cute little graphs where everything is fitted into the flood context. And at that point, his imagination shuts down. And he certainly has not shown any indication whatsoever of looking into any of the archaeological paleontological examples that relate to Neolithic settlements where these haplotypes and direct genetic information is showing up that don't match up with any of the stratigraphy. The moment you take a deposit where, which is by any legitimate archaeological context is old, it's not post-Roman, It's not post Hittites or ancient Egypt. It's much older than that, by a long time. That you then are assuming that because that haplotype is showing up, that they somehow have to be picked up and pulled thousands of years into the future and drop down in a period past the Bronze Age. And yet not realizing that that stuff connected up with the cultures that they have and the kind of trade goods that they have, and even in some specific instances where they've been working out what kind of food grains and things they have that varies depending upon the climate and microclimates and that all. The meticulous amount of research that's accumulated that interlock all this material, he's totally disconnected from. And I don't think they're ever going to be connected to it. They're never going to be able to assess all that information and sort it out in a way that isn't going to make people go, even within their own community. The ones who sort of bump into aspects of the information, not on the chronology end, but on the phylogenetics and genetics end, where they represent organisms branching within the Barrowmans in a way that sounds a little too evolutionary, for Ken Ham's taste, can indicate that somebody like Jensen may have a direct incentive to not buck the bunch at Answers in Genesis. And so given how thin Traced is, I would think there would be nothing that would stop him from cycling along and putting out some more stuff later on in another book. Michael Behe has produced several books in that respect. He at least tries to document things at a little more sophisticated level than Jensen does. That is something with its own pitfalls, because at that point you can bump into the information at a much more direct technical level and realize how he's misrepresenting the source material, and you're just going, Rrr. But Jensen is not getting at that level. This is a step down. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that stuff is going to connect together in the coming years, and also the moving target of how much we know about human prehistory, going back, even if you decide not to pay any attention to the Australopithecines, just the material within our own genus over the last few 100,000 years, and the ebb and flow of settlements as Homo sapiens spread around and landed in Asia and starts differentiating into various haplotypes, and branches are going off to Australia and all the rest. I mentioned last week how just ludicrously clunky his attempts to ram all that stuff in. But if you have somebody who is literally trying to ramrod all of the human genetic types into the descendants of Noah's 3 kids, pigeonholing all of that into that simple of a relationship, and have all of that change generated in only the last 4,500 years, means levels of mutation rates and population distributions and population movements that are Looney Tunes implausible to deal with. And the fact that he's sitting here in the Americas, what does he bring up? He brings up the Maya, a culture that is in the times, most of which is post-Christian period. And so he's well removed from that. Now he can safely come down and accept the radiocarbon dating and accept the stratigraphy analysis, and never think about the fact that none of the people working in the Mesoamerican archaeology field are buying into the idea that the American populations only arrived in the Christian period, which is the model that Jensen has. And so I think if you ever try to present any of this in a regular scientific venue, it's going to be a rib tickler, to say the least. So I'll give a little presage. Of course, we'll be slogging along source by source by source to try to figure out whether or not he ends up with all the material. It means that we probably won't get some real rib ticklers until the next book that I'll be doing after Jensen, which is going to be this little puppy, Titans of the Earth, Sea, and Air by Jonathan Sarfati and Joel Tay. They've got source references at the end of each chapter structurally, which is very much like Pandas and People did exactly the same way. But it's not immediately obvious what's been cited where and for what purpose. So definitely going to be going through that to construct a proper source bibliography and reference base. I'm suspecting, oh, hi. I'm suspecting that the Sarfati book will have very little new references at all, even though it's quite a recent book. And it's basically parasitizing regular paleontology and all of that. It may be some obscure taxa in there, although he doesn't seem to be diving tremendously into obscure taxa. And the other issue, of course, which I'm relating to as well, there's still a few of Jensen's creationist papers that are in his reference bibliography that he hasn't cited yet. And I'm waiting for that little shoe to drop. I'll be waiting for exactly the same kind of a shoe to drop in the Sarfati case to see at what point does he dispense with the joke that they're actually paying on the scientific data and instead start trotting out their creationist interpretations. The other interesting little sidebar question that pops up increasingly in young earth creationist apologetics is the times when they are forced, because of the nature of their bad penetration of certain science fields, to suck up intelligent design stuff. So little bits of Michael Behe, little bits of Michael Denton, little bits of Steve Meyer, and all of that, playing little smorgasbord games. So far, we don't see any smorgasbording going on with Jensen. He's too much cycling his own papers to kind of do that. But we'll be interested to see what happens with Sarfati. And so this way you can get some taxonomy as to who does what where. Sarfati, by contrast, incidentally, Jensen is a pretty good chunk of postings over the years. He's done stuff at the Institute for Creation Research, articles and that, quite a lot. But Sarfati's been at it longer. So he has a huge backlog going back into the 1990s of stuff, both in the technical journals that creationists have, but also in the Creation magazine and these various other ones, often just recycling the same material over and over and over and over and over again. And Sarfati gets quite a few little mentions in Volume 2 of Rocks for There, as he had gotten a relatively sparse discussion in Volume 1. But Volume 2, we're going to be diving into more areas that he's dived into with considerable mess. And an awful lot of these people are going to be coming up in the human evolution area, which is one of the primary hot spots, hot button obsessions for anti-evolutionism generally, both young earth creationists and old earth creationists and intelligent design, independent of how old they think the earth is or whether they think there was a global flood or not. All anti-evolutionists will coalesce together in really not liking a natural origin for human beings. And so their tendency to wade in on that topic is much more important. It's no coincidence that the longest chapter in Philip Johnson's Old Darwin on Trial was the one he had on human evolution. And it revealed how you could write a chapter that long and manage to get so much screwed up and so superficially. You find exactly the same arguments going on, going back to the Twain Gish era in the 1990s books and all of that. So it's going to be a fun and game things, particularly because just on my own, even independently of what we were doing with Jackson and writing on the Rocks for Their project, I've been keeping lots of track of the human evolution material. And then thanks also to somebody who's directly in the field of this area, who pays much closer attention to it and bumps into it at the collegiate level, Erica, aka Gutsick Gibbon, who is a primatologist, although human evolution in particular is not her primary area. She is interested in some of the old and New World apes and that variety, which is actually a bit earlier. She's naturally familiar with the stuff and can look at a fossil at a forensic level, much more sophisticated than either Jackson or I, being neither one of us are paleontologists. So all of that stuff, she gives a window into some of this material. And I'm also been keeping close tabs on the output of CMI and ICR in terms of their various apologetic stuff. The Discovery Institute, meanwhile, over in ID land, has started to fizzle out a little more. Bill Dembski's old Uncommon Descent website has finally bit the dust. It had gotten taken over by a bunch of relatively shallow ideologues who managed to go really nowhere fast with it. And so that now is leaving just the Discovery Institute, rather insular, and market penetration dropping quite a bit. I think the most recent thing they were doing in any great detail on human evolution was a little book that Casey Luskin did with Ann Gager, and I think Jonathan Wells was one of the co-authors as well. That doesn't exactly set the house on fire in terms of details. It's basically retreads of the kind of arguments that they were doing at their postings. The sheer volume of material on the paleontology relating to human origins, and the issues about when and under what circumstances fire use was occurring, and the development potentially of language, and the genetic information. There's been just an incredible sea change with the advent of mitogenomics with Neanderthal genomes. And to a certain extent, the inferred ones from the Denisovans and the mystery third group out there, that for which so far no fossil confirmation has fitted in, but is still operating in the genetic level, that there was another population group lurking around somewhere or other that pops up as little components in our existing genome. I'd love to see a creationist try to figure out which kid of Ham, which kids of Noah that one relates to, or are they pre-Adamic, like the Nephilim or something like that? I mean, the Nephilim, by the way, will be brought up in volume 2 because we've got the flood stories and the whole bits about that wacky cartoon pre-flood world that they have a bit with, and how they just can't help mangling the history of prehistory. And it's now that area brings us into a larger cottage area, because you've got a whole bunch of pseudoscience believers who talk about ancient astronauts and lost super civilizations and all of that are treading a lot of the same turf as young Earth creationists. And so occasionally you can see the young Earth creationists kind of avoid certain topics. Göbekli Tepe, which is one of the very earliest monumental sites in Europe. I think it goes back like 8,000 BC, something like that. There's relatively little coverage on it in the creationist area, and I don't think intelligent designers pay any attention to it at all. There's so many fields that they just simply bypass. But every attempt that they do jump into it, they're making just the same kind of bad arguments as you find with the pseudoscience crowd that believe in super aliens and pyramids being constructed by transdimensional beings. And sometimes when you get down below the upper echelons to the grassroots, there's a cross-fertilization of stupid at that level. And we'll be bringing a lot of that stuff. Yeah, it surprised me in writing my part of the book that how often somebody over in the creationist community is linking up with some nutball in the wackaloon category, who then connects up with other wackaloons in other little areas. And all of those are going to be put into an assortment of interesting little, hopefully interesting little info boxes. So I think I've covered most of that material. Our signal has been really straightforward. Unless we have some questions from the live stream, I think it's okay to put a kibosh on that and conclude the hour at a half hour this time around. Next week, I will give you a teaser that we now hit in Jensen's book one of the really head up the ass dumb parts of his argument that slams directly into a topic that's going to be in volume 2 of Rocks Were There. And that is the notion that certain Native Americans have connections to prehistory that supposedly reflect the flood directly in their lore, and involving a particular guy who has translated a text which, darn it all, has one teeny tiny little problem, and that is it's likely a forgery in the 19th century. It's the Walam Olum. And that one slammed straight into pseudoarchaeology and all of that. And it was just one of those little jaw dropper moments when I realized that Jensen was diving in on this issue, affirming the authenticity of this just jerk-brained pseudoscientific translation of this non-existent Native American text. And so I'll be putting some of the little blurbs next week that's going to figure in a new volume of Roxford 2, volume 2, which will be kind of a little teaser a little bit on that. It was just a really amazing stuff. That the level of pseudoscience and just credulity and laziness in terms of researching things, straw grasping on misinterpreting petroglyphs and searching for supposedly living pterosaurs in the Southwest. And it's just almost an endless stream of, oh, you've got to be kidding. It can't possibly get any worse. Oh, yes, it can. So the Walam Olam is one that accumulated so much material on misrepresentations of ancient lore about who supposedly had flood legends, that turned into quite an extensive appendix that's going to be in the new book. What we'll be removing the appendix on the genetic code that was in volume 1. We'll be still keeping, of course, the chronology appendix and the listing of the phyla. That's too much straightforward not to have that. But we will then be adding in a couple flood-related material on, of course, the legends of the flood as one appendix, and another appendix which will be going into the wacky little diseases and stuff that existed in the past that make the flood argument sound yet more implausible as to sequence. And then an appendix which will be quite an extensive one, which will break down the Ark Encounters list of kinds, which no one has done really rigorously, and we'll be breaking it down by which item Barrowmans are aboard in alphabetical order, which they don't do in the Ark Encounter, and document what they are bringing up as to why they could possibly be doing what they do and what they would have to be leaving out. So it's going to be quite a juicy little material, and that will make volume 2 of The Rocks Were There easily as massive as volume 1. Hopefully we'll be able to do that in a volume 2. I'd hate to have to split it to a third book, but we'll see. It all depends on how much material is constructed from all the other zones, but we got an awful lot of stuff to do. And after all, when Jackson offered this project to me, it was the intention to dive in a rigorous way with 4 different Answers in Genesis books that dive into these various subject matters. And so the idea that it was not going to be an extensive treatment kind of came with the territory. So anyway, everybody stay safe, stay cool, avoid disasters, plagues, firearm rampaging nutballs, and any of these other things if you possibly can, except no wooden penguins. I know I never do. Wooden wombats as well, I think. And see you all next week. Take care of everybody and have fun. The universe is an interesting place, isn't it? Okie doke. See you next